two different approaches to reverse an array in Java. The first approach will be to return a new array, and the second is to reverse the elements of the array in place. So let's get started. I want to first give you an example of what I mean by reversing an array in Java, and the best way to do that is an example. So suppose we have this test array with elements 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. The reverse of that array will be 50, 40, 30, 20, and 10. The first element of the reverse array will be the last element of the original array. The second element of the reverse array will be the second to last element of the original array. The third element of the reverse array will be the third to last element of that original array, and so on. And there'll be two approaches I'll show to you. So let's first walk through that first approach of returning a brand new array. I'm going to start by writing a public static function that's going to return an int array, and let's call this reverse1. The argument to it will be an int array, and we'll call this input. In this function, we're going to return a brand new array, so let's start by defining that array. So it's going to be an array of the same length as the input. And we can do that like that. So we'll have some logic in here that I'll define shortly that will set the different values of the reversed array. And once we've set all the values of that reversed array, we can finally return that at the end of the function. So now let's think through how to set the values when reversing an array. We're going to use a for loop, and the for loop helps us because we want to go through every single element of the input array and use that to set the reversed array. So we'll have a loop that goes over the length of input. We'll start our loop at 0 and go till the index is less than input.length. And each time we go through the loop, we want to increment our index by 1. Every time we go through this loop, we have to set a different value of reversed. So we have to set a different value of reversed to something. I'm not sure how we do this yet, but let's talk through this. The 0th index of reverse, or the first value of reverse, will be the last value of test. The second value of reverse will be the second to last value of test. The third value of reverse will be the third to last value of test, and so on. So each time our index in reverse increases by 1, we want to get the index of this input that was 1 less than the index we got before. That's kind of complicated to sort of hear through words, so let's just start by writing an expression that'll correctly get and set this 50, the first value of the reversed array. The first value of the reversed array is just the last value of this input, and we know how to do that. If we took our, had a little computer issue there. If we took our input array and we got the value at input.length minus 1, this will always grab the last value of an array. So the first time this loop runs, for example, reversed at 0 will be equal to input at input.length, which is 5, minus 1. So reversed at the 0th index will be set to input at 4, which is 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. This 50. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So right now we have an expression that would correctly set the 0th index, but the problem with this expression right now is it's only setting the 0th index correctly. Every other value in the array would be set to 50, which is not what we want. We want to set the second value of the array to the second to last value, not the last value in the array, the third value in this reversed array to the third to last value in the input array. And to do that, we have to add this offset of minus index. So notice the first time it runs, it doesn't actually change that expression because index is equal to 0. Input.length minus 1 is the same number it was before for any size of the input array. But what it helps us with is every time index changes by 1 or 2 or 3, it's going to grab that second to last value in the case when index is equal to 1. or the third to last value when index is equal to 2, and it helps us set the other values of the array correctly. And that's it. Let's get rid of this comment and quickly write a test that shows how this function works. So I'll keep this test array for 10, 20, 30, and 40, and 50, and actually I'll leave this as a comment so we can see what the expected value should be. So we'll create a new array that'll store the response of our function called to reverse 1. We'll call this reverse result. And we'll call our reverse 1 function and pass to it the input, which is test. We'll get back in our new array stored in reverse result, and let's print this out. So if we have system.out.println to print an array, we can use arrays.toString, and let's pass to it the reverse result. I also need to quickly import this arrays library, and to do that, I'll highlight over it in my editor and type import class, and then up here I can see that the import went through. So now that this is done, I'll run my program and see that I have indeed reversed the array. I can see that there's a 50, 40, 30, 20, and 10. So it does indeed look like the elements of this test array were successfully reversed using this function over here. This function is going to return a brand new array, and let's just go over this one more time real quickly. We're given an input as an argument to this function, and the very first thing we have to do, since we're returning a brand new array, is to define a new array of the same length, and that's what we do right here on this line 15, reversed. Next, in this loop over here, we need to go through every single index in that reversed array and set it accordingly using whatever comes in as an argument to this function. We set the left-hand side of the equal to reversed at index because we want to set each index of the reversed array starting at 0, going all the way 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on till input.length. And then the expression on the right-hand side is going to tell us what value we're putting in the reversed array. And we talk through it in words, and we want to, if we're at index 0, get the 0th to last element, or basically the last element in the list of test. And if it's the first element in the reversed array, we want to get the second to last element of the input or test array. And if it's the second index over here, we want to get the third to last element, or this 30 right there. We talk through that, and then after the loop is finished, we'd have correctly set the values of the array, and we're then good to return that reversed array. Now, the second approach I'm going to show to you is also going to reverse the array, but it's going to do it in place, meaning we're not going to define a new int array in our function. We're instead going to modify the argument that we get to that function that we're going to write down below. So going back to this example of 10, 20, 30, and 40, and 50, another way you can sort of think of reversing the array is as a series of swaps. If we're able to swap the first array, or the first element of the array, with the last element of the array, the 10 and 50, then the 20 and 40, and so on till we hit the middle of the array, if we work with pairs of numbers, swapping them, we'd be able to sort of accomplish the same thing. So let's take the first number and the last number and swap them. It would look like 50 and 10. If we took the second number and second to last number and swap them, we'd go get a 40 here and a 20 here. And that's it. We stop at the midway point. There's no more swapping that needs to be done since we've considered all the pairs of numbers. This 30 is a lonely 30. It doesn't have anybody it can be paired with. And by swapping all the pairs, we get to that same result of the reversed array. So let's sort of write that function right now. It's also going to be a public static function, and instead of returning an array this time, it's a void function. It's not returning anything. And we'll call this reverse2. It's also going to require an int array as an argument, and we'll also call this input. A function we need to define before we can actually start on this reverse is that swap. So this reverse 2 is going to rely heavily on using swaps to get the work done. So let's write that function right now. It's going to be a public static void function also. Sorry about that. We'll call this swap. It's going to take an input and the two indexes it needs to swap. So swap functions are really common in Java or any other programming language. And if you have any questions on the swap that I'm going to define, the internet's a great resource for searching for any follow-up questions you may have. Just a good Google search on how to swap numbers in Java in an array will help you if you have any questions after this. So let's first give you an example just to make sure we're double checked on the same page. If we had this input 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50 as our input array, and index 1 was equal to 1, and index 2 was equal to, I don't know, 3, and we were to call swap with these values, what we'd want at the end is the value at index 1, that 1, this one over here, and the value at index 2, that 3, so 1, 2, 3, the 4, so this 20 and 40, we'd want them to be swapped. So it looked like 10, 40, 30, 20, and 50. So that's what the goal of this function is, and I'm going to write out what it looks like. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to define a temp variable, and inside it I'm going to store the value at index 1. After I've done that, I'll take the input at index 1, and to that value I'll assign to it the input at index 2, and once that's done, I'll take the input at index 2 and I'll assign into that temp. Seems a little confusing, but let me walk through how it works line by line, and I'll reset the example I had of an array with numbers 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. And we'll maintain the same arguments of index 1 is equal to 1 and index 2 is equal to 3. The code will start running. Line 29, temp will be equal to input at index 1, so let's write that out. Temp is equal to input at index 1, so index of 1 is equal to 20. Now the second line, line 30 runs. Input at index 1 is equal to input at index 2. That means the value that's going into here, input at index 1, is equal to the value at input at index 2, which is that 40, so this will now become 40. Then line 31 runs, input at index 2 is equal to temp, so input at that third index will be equal to 20. So 0, 1, 2, 3 equal to 20. So done. Looks like our swap function works. It was able to take our array and given two indexes, it was able to swap the values in there. So I'll get rid of this comment, and now let's go back to this reverse 2 function. Let's scroll up a little so we have our reverse 1 implementation still in scope. And similar to reverse 1, we're going to need a for loop. But this for loop is going to be a little different. We're going to still want to start out at index 0, but instead of going for every element in the input, since we're only working with pairs, we want to go up until input.length divided by 2. So every time we're swapping with the array, we're taking two numbers with it. So we're getting the work done for two numbers each time we go through the loop, and that's the reason why we don't have to go for the full length of input. So every time we go through that loop, we want to swap two numbers together. So we'd want like the first number swap with the last number, then the second to first number swap with the second to last number, and so on until we hit that midpoint. And that midpoint, if it's an odd numbered list, it doesn't need to be switched. So in that example of 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50, this 30 stayed in the middle, didn't have to be moved at all. Sounds good? Let's start on this function body. We already have index, which is going to be one of the indexes we need to pass the swap. And now we need two other arguments. We have the input, so we actually have 2 out of the 3 arguments. We just need to figure out what that other index is that we're swapping. So I'll say int other index is equal to question mark, because we'll figure out what that is shortly. But once we know what that is, we can call swap with our input, our index, and our other index. Now, when we're swapping numbers, we want to swap the first number in our input with the last number, the second to first number with the second to last number, and so on. And we want to borrow, essentially, this expression that we figured out earlier to determine what the other index is. So when we're at the 0th number, which is the first number of the list, we want to get the last number to swap with. And that expression over here, input.length minus 1, will always give us the last number in a list. And if we subtract from it 0, the index, it doesn't change that, which means we're good for our swap. Over here, next loop runs, index is now 1. It's the second number from the start. We want to get the second to last number from the end of the array. Our other index will be input.length minus 1, which is the last number, or the index of the last number in the array. Subtract 1, now we get the index of the second to last number of the array, and we swap those two together. So that's it. That's all we need to do for a swap. These 4 lines over here in the function itself, and then this swap over here, those 3 lines that help us swap 2 numbers in an array. Now let's write some tests to see it actually working in action. So I'm going to erase the example we made for reverse 1, and I'm going to still use that same input of 10, 20, 30, and 40, and 50 just to be consistent. And we'll call this time reverse 2 on it. It's still going to require an array as an argument, but notice this time it returns void. And that's because we're not actually returning a new array. We're going to modify this test array in place. So once we've called reverse 2 on it, we can print it out using that same logic of system.out.println with arrays.toString, and we can pass to it that test array. The name of the array won't change after the function is called. So we have our test ready, 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50, and looks good. We have indeed 50, 40, 30, 20, and 10 in our reversed array. And quickly I want to walk through a couple more examples. So let's say we had an array of even length being 10, 20, 30, and 40. If we ran that, notice still works, function's rock solid, 40, 30, 20, and 10. And let's say our input was just one number, so there's no pairs in that reverse logic. Our code still looks good. And that's it. That's 2 different ways to reverse an array in Java. The first approach being making a new array and assigning to it values 1 by 1, and the second approach being taking pairs of numbers in our original array that we take as an argument and swapping them. And that's it. Thanks for watching and hope that helps.